the reason I picked this, I read this quite a few years ago, and obviously Professor Saad is a friend of the show. But what I like to do with book clubs, I know that some people would like a description of what exactly the book contains, and we read the book on their behalf.
Mm-hmm.
But especially considering this is, I think, free to listen on Audible if you're a member, but if not, go out and buy the book.
It is, yeah.
And support Professor Saad, particularly because as he said on Joe Rogan, the Canadian government took like half the earnings from this. So
What?
yeah,
Why?
because of
hear about
how
that.
Canada's self-employment tax code works. So make sure he can keep his house, I suppose. We don't just want to list off everything that's in this book. What we wanted to do specifically is take some of the ideas and springboard into the wider literature and expand the scope of it. Because I enjoyed the book, but one of my main criticisms, as I've said to you off air, was that the central theme, the hypothesis that Saad has, particularly about mind parasites, it doesn't get carried all throughout. And there are some avenues we can go down, specifically in the evolutionary psych area of expertise that he has, that can expand upon the ideas that he puts forth in this, and it will hopefully make it quite a valuable accompanying piece.
Sure. Shall we briefly talk about what we thought of the book before we get into some of the details?
Please do.
So yeah, I actually thought it was a really good introduction to some of the wokeness that goes on in the world, particularly in North America and Canada, for anyone who hasn't necessarily been following it. But I did find that there were lots of examples that even I hadn't heard of. Well, not lots. I mean, I've been doing this for years now, but there are still some where I'm just like, oh, I didn't know that about that, or oh, I haven't heard about that. And it was quite useful as a sort of almost dictionary of woke events that are significant and good examples to bring up of saying, okay, well, you're denying that this thing happens. Well, here's an example of it that's undeniable.
Yeah, there is utility to having a sort of journalistic approach to this. I know Michael Knowles did it in Speechless as well, of where the narrative shifts so quickly that you do need to archive these news events quite comprehensively, so that not just history is written by the victors, but when we're countering this hegemony years down the line, we have books like this as a reference point to say, okay, here's exactly what happened with Trump derangement syndrome. Here's exactly what happens with Carl's Patreon ban that you mentioned in here.
Yeah, it's a good snapshot of a window of history, and I think that he does a good job of explaining the issues in question as well. And I agree with Professor Saad's perspective on it as well. I think he puts forward why these things are wrong in a very compelling way, in that he's keeping it relatively simple. He's just saying, well, these people want to restrict speech. I think free speech is important, that sort of thing, those kinds of arguments. And although if you're well seasoned in this sort of politics, it might not necessarily be any news to you, these arguments, just seeing them presented well is nice, and it's a very easy read as well, although I listened to it, but I found it quite engaging throughout, and I don't know whether you felt the same.
Yeah, of course, and having watched Professor Saad's content, he's very likeable. Some of the anecdotes, and you can tell, again, he told Joe that he wanted to make it his life's work because he wanted to personalise it and make it a little bit autobiographical. Sometimes not all the stories were needed, but woe betide me to tell the author not to put some things down he thought were important in there just because I wanted a little bit more psychological literature. One of the important things, I think, before I move on to the actual content of the book, is that this is a useful piece to talk within the circles of academia, because he does make a clarion call to act as the honey badger, as he said, to have some testicular fortitude, to stand up to the screaming students in your own class that aren't willing to give you forgiveness anyway, so not to cave. There was one bit where he said, ideological Stalinism is the daily reality on North American college campuses. Any freedom-loving person should be appalled by this, and yet most academics yawn in complicit apathy and cowardly inaction. They are too worried about their selfish, careerist considerations to weigh in on these matters. And I remember reading once before, I think it might have been Stephen Hicks, but I would like to be corrected, that the Berkeley riots of the 2016 were practically replicated by the free speech disruptions and protests of the 1960s, and where the leftists were claiming free speech against the Vietnam draft and the likes as a tool to undermine what they saw as right-wing or capitalist hegemony, even though they're not standing on principle. And so it's useful to document the trajectory that the academy is going in at this moment in time out into the future.
And I think that his description of how academia works and that side of things was actually really, really good. And I think that his way of explaining the environment of academia and things like even what a meta-analysis is to a lay reader really is some of the best I've seen. And I think that that's actually really good, because I find it quite difficult sometimes to explain the environment, because sometimes when you live and breathe something, it's very difficult to articulate to your average person in the easiest way possible what it is. And I think that
I
that's
know
done
this as a comic book fan who has dived deep into the weeds in Comics Corner, and then we occasionally get the comments of, hey, look, I like hearing you guys talk, but I've never read any of this stuff, so do you mind starting from ground zero for a change? And I think he does quite a good job with that. So I'll move on to the preface. So the opening paragraph: when we think of a pandemic, we often conjure images of deadly infectious diseases that spread rapidly across countries, causing unimaginable human suffering, like the Black Death, Spanish influenza, AIDS, or the ongoing COVID-19 crisis. Last one being slightly less deadly than the others, thankfully, of course. The West is currently suffering from such a devastating pandemic, a collective malady that destroys people's capacity to think rationally. Unlike other pandemics where biological pathogens are to blame, the current culprit is composed of a collection of bad ideas spawned on university campuses that chip away at our edifices of reason, freedom, and individual dignity. This book identifies these idea pathogens, discusses their spread from the universities to all walks of life, including politics, business, and popular culture, and offers ways to inoculate ourselves from their devastating effects. So in the ensuing chapters, Saad coins the following terms, which we'll be going over: biophobia, which is the fear of biology; the oppression Olympics, intersectionality, of course; collective Munchausen; the homeostasis of victimology, I'm a victim, therefore I am; ostrich parasitic syndrome, which is a malady of disordered thinking that robs people of their ability to recognize truths. Now, with the opening preface, I do have one or two critiques, and that is, as throughout the book, he focuses almost entirely on the scientific method, because he is a qualified psychologist. If you would like a perspective on how the over-scienticizing of discourse, which preceded now postmodernism, that has robbed us of our ability to assert things sentimentally and romantically, watch Carl and I's previous book club on C.S. Lewis, because I do think the doctrines that he's identifying rob us as much of our ability to speak from the gut as they do from the mind. And I think we'll get later on to how he devalues non-rational, non-empirical epistemologies a little too much when I think they're his friend.
Yeah, I think that although I'm very sympathetic to his perspective, and I mean, I ultimately do agree that empiricism is great.
Yeah.
I mean, I've got nothing bad to say about it. And of course, I've practiced the scientific method for years at this point. So I'm not going to necessarily be critical, but you should be grounded in how much weight you should give them. Even following the scientific method and going through with these processes, you're still a fallible human being, and to put too much weight on the conclusions therein is to potentially mislead yourself unwittingly, because of course no human being is the perfect scientist, and you're always going to bring biases to the table. There are always going to be things that you overlook, and to have perhaps a little bit more, I don't want to say humility because it sounds like I'm saying that he's arrogant, which is not what I mean,
No.
but that other things do have a bit more weight, so your experiences are still relevant. You can still apply those, just don't necessarily think that they're comparable to, say, a systematic review of the literature.
Yeah, it might be, your intuition might be a signpost to moral truths, but you should examine it and scrutiny. And that's why when we're later talk about nomological networks, I think you not just need an empirical nomological network, but what is really useful is a nomological network of epistemological methods.
Would it be okay for the audience to be able to translate what a
nomological
network
I'll
is?
quickly get down. It's a system of verifying a psychological concept in this by using different strains of evidence. So not only empirical testing, but observation of cultures. I know Peterson and Saad had a conversation where they drew the analogy of the five senses. If you can taste, touch, smell, see an object, then that makes it more verifiable than if you just could experience it with one of the senses.
Yeah, that makes intuitive sense, doesn't it? That if you're testing something with all of your senses, then you know it truly exists. Whereas, for example, your eyes can be deceived by things like optical illusions, whereas your other senses can verify whether this is an optical illusion or not.
Yeah, if they're all acting in concert, then at that point it is either true or so indistinguishable from true that it's a simulation, but you might as well operate in it anyway, unless you're going to unplug yourself from the Matrix.
To watch the full video, please become a premium member at lotuseaters.com.